for each of the states represented here on this panel, we are looking at quite sizable operating surpluses, not only for the 2016-17 year, but subsequent budget forecasts as well. So that's actually a good place for us to start. So perhaps if I could reach to you in the first instance, Gladys, give us a little bit of your thinking around budget strategy with that surplus in mind, and perhaps where you might see some challenges going forward as well, please.
Certainly. Just tell me when to shut up, because we could talk a lot about this for a long time.
For me to say.
But we're very proud as a government, not just to have forecasted surpluses moving forward, but last week, actually a few days ago, I was able to announce publicly during the tabling of our total state sector accounts that New South Wales has a cash positive position in our general government sector. So we've got zero debt. In fact, we're cash positive, which is the first time that's happened in decades. So we have, for us, our fiscal strategy has been keeping expenses down through things like wages growth, ensuring back office operations are as efficient as possible, and making sure that if you do have any additional windfall, that it goes straight into infrastructure. So not in the middle management of public service, but make sure that it goes into infrastructure. In addition to that, we obviously have our asset recycling strategy, which has allowed us to use billions up front into investing in productive infrastructure. So that's essentially been our very briefly, our budget strategy. And New South Wales is in the enviable position now, if I can brag for just 30 seconds, that we have a cash positive position, budget surpluses, record infrastructure spending to the tune of more than $73 billion over the next 4 years, nation's strongest jobs growth, and increased spending in services. But clearly for all of us as state governments, no matter how well you're doing, there are always pressures on the recurrent side of the budget. So revenue growth is always a challenge. We've witnessed, and I think the key to success for New South Wales has been because of our consistent, certain and good management of the infrastructure pipeline, our investment in infrastructure has supported private investment in New South Wales, which has spurred on economic growth and jobs growth. And that formula has given us the trifecta of surpluses, no debt, record spending, AAA credit rating, and the list goes on, but I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Tim, Victorian budget announced an operating surplus of $2.9 billion in 2016-17, and surpluses averaging $2.1 billion each year over the forward estimates. So a very good place to start as well.
Yeah, look, I think the story for Victoria is that we're keen to make sure that we have strong operating surpluses going forward. I think in total $9.2 billion worth of operating surpluses over the forward estimates, but it's a discipline also about making sure that we ensure that our expenditure is below our revenue growth, and we've had that as a statement of faith as a government going forward. So our debt has declined from when we came into government, from about 6.2% of the size of the economy to about 4.6%. Our aim ultimately is to actually progressively increase our debt levels to about 6% of GSP. And the purpose behind that is to make the appropriate investment, but to have a consistent debt profile so that people can see exactly where the investment is going in the long term. Rational infrastructure with a substantive agenda being prosecuted. So if you look at our average infrastructure spend in the state of Victoria, $4.9 billion over the last 10 years, we're increasing it to $7.4 billion a year going forward, and that's helped, I think, turn the Victorian economy around. We've got 177,000 new jobs created in the last 2 years. 117,000 of those are full-time jobs. So the economy is growing very fast, and our aim is to make sure that so far as the state can assist, we have the right infrastructure being built at the right time.
And if I may just ask, Victoria is investing heavily in infrastructure as well, as which you heard from New South Wales?
So as I said, increasing our infrastructure spend from $4.9 to $7.4 billion a year on average gives us an enormous infrastructure agenda. And I think the key to that is the work that's recently come out of Infrastructure Victoria. They can be somewhat irritating bodies, independent bodies that tell us exactly how we should spend money over a 30-year period, but they're important because they create a sense of community engagement, a sense of rationality in terms of the choices that government has to make. And it also places an obligation on government to respond to it, identify where our priorities lie and why, to the extent that we're differing from that advice, why we believe that the public should support those choices rather than the alternative expert advice.
Thank you. And Tom, South Australian budget forecast is also to an operating surplus across 16-17 and as well as the forward estimates. I note as well that you are projecting to increase infrastructure spending quite a lot as well, and a focus on the boosting jobs and growth.
Well, it's no coincidence you've got three treasurers who started as transport and infrastructure ministers who seem to like running healthy budget surpluses, who seem to like cutting taxes and seem to like investing in infrastructure. And it's something I think the state should be very proud of. Our fiscal position compared to the Commonwealth is much healthier. Most of us have achieved budget surpluses not through tax increases, not through bracket creep, but through restraint spending on our recurrent spending through our budget measures, and are investing more in infrastructure. And what you're seeing in places like New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia is infrastructure that's generating growth and investing in the economy. We're not borrowing money to pay wages or for recurrent spending. We're borrowing money to invest in important infrastructure. In South Australia, many of you may or may not have seen things like the new Adelaide Oval. It's not so much about the sport, but as much as about an economic piece of infrastructure. We've spent a lot of money on upgrading our hospital system and our schools. But importantly, we've done all that with restraint internally. So our budget surpluses aren't so much about the growth aspects of our revenues, because our revenues have been declining over a period of time. We've been cutting our own expenditure, which is quite a remarkable feat for a state of our size. I think many of you would be expecting states like South Australia and Tasmania to have structural deficits across their forward estimates. What we've been able to do by our own restraint is actually achieve budget surpluses with declining revenues. And that's something that our government's very, very proud of, and I think it's a message for the Commonwealth that you can achieve budget surpluses with restraint. It takes discipline, it takes foresight, and most of all it takes courage. I think what you're seeing from the eastern seaboards is an example to the Commonwealth Government that you can achieve fiscal surpluses and good fiscal outcomes and tax cuts and deliver good outcomes for the economy. South Australia, ultimately, if we don't spend money on infrastructure, it's very hard for the private sector to invest given the size of our economy. But yes, like Tim, we've got very similar targets in terms of our debt to revenue ratios and of course our debt to gross state product. We're running a debt to gross state product in the last financial year of 3.9%, which is, I think, a relatively good number for a state of our size. Our debt to revenue ratios are below 35%, so if South Australia were a household of $100,000 income, our debt levels are about $24,000, so 24% of debt to revenue. So we're running a good set of books, but there are challenges, and those challenges come from the Commonwealth withdrawing further and further away from services. Vertical fiscal imbalance obviously is a big problem for states. But ultimately, if we don't spend that money on infrastructure, the question is who will? And that's the big question that states face going forward.
Lovely, thank you very much. So colleagues, in the first tranche we can certainly see the forward-looking priorities of the Treasurers, a lot of emphasis around infrastructure for the right reasons, but also starting to just touch a little bit around that federal-state relationship as well. And I think we might go there in a little bit. But let's come to taxation reform. Earlier in the year, we heard of COAG's commitment to explore changes to the Federation, driving economic reform. Certainly at Chartered Accountants, we've been very strong that for this nation's prosperity, we do need a sustainable tax base and a reform of the taxation system as well. So I come to the Treasurers to talk a little bit around taxation reform. Could I ask each of them your medium-term priorities for state-based reform? And obviously then as a follow-up, I'd like to start some conversation around GST and whether there's opportunities for reform there as well. Gladys?
Thank you. Well, since we've been in government, we've done quite a bit within our own realm in relation to tax reform. So we've managed up with the payroll tax threshold. We will be from 1 July next year. I know the other mainland states have already done this, but we are changing the way in which we collect emergency services levy in New South Wales from an insurance-based premium model to a property levy, which the other states have already done. But we've also obviously engaged in debate with our state colleagues in the federal government in relation to other opportunities. But I think it's important for us to have the conversation about what are we trying to achieve? And what we're trying to achieve when we talk tax reform is reducing the burden on our citizens, but also being more efficient in the way in which we manage resources. And if that's the outcome, in the same breath, we should be having a conversation about modernising the federation, reducing waste and duplication. And I don't think you can have that conversation in isolation. It's got to be about how can governments manage themselves better. And I think, to be honest, I'm really excited in New South Wales about the enormous things we're doing with data analytics and big data and how we're managing ourselves better. And I almost feel that the Federation is a couple of decades past its use-by date in terms of how we manage ourselves. And the digital age is pushing us in another direction. So I would like to have those conversations. Tax reform shouldn't be looked at in isolation because it will never happen in isolation. It's got to be looked at how can we manage ourselves better as a federation, and that will be part of the suite of things we need to do about the future. So I think we need to broaden the debate, and I think there isn't a single Australian, no matter which state they live in, what their circumstances, who doesn't want to see less duplication, less waste, and easier transparency about who manages what that matters to them.
Okay, so I think we can go in a next conversation around the federal relations with the states as well. Could I ask, just in terms of GST specifically, is there something that do you believe that is holding back how we can advance some reform in that space? Is there one or two things that if they said to you, what could we change now that you think would give us some momentum to reform?
Well, I think the challenge, and Tim can elaborate when it's his turn, I mean, we had two large states in Queensland and Victoria who did not support the proposal. So when the states aren't united, it's very difficult to try and mount a public conversation. But we've been very, in the past, very public and bold in what we've said. We believe as a state, Premier down, that it's really important to have a public conversation. We're all mature enough to be able to say, what is our system? How can we make things better? How can we make, at the end of the day, it's about resource management. How can we make every dollar each of us has go further, and how can we look at things a bit more collectively? So we're always up for those conversations, but we're also realistic. We know the GST debate's come and gone, and it's not on the agenda, but there's a whole bunch of other things we can talk about. And we're excited by that, and I think we're all getting together formally actually in a couple of weeks, to discuss some of those issues. So I think it's about, I think when you look at something in isolation, you risk missing opportunities for other things. And I'd like to think that there's a lot of goodwill amongst the states, irrespective of our political hue, about improving the status quo. And I think we can find common ground. And I think we're at a stage now where we've worked together sufficiently to know the constraints that each of us has in terms of our own population. But I also feel there's sufficient goodwill for us to allow things to move forward.
Okay, thank you. Tim, medium-term priorities on tax reform from your state's perspective, and then obviously some reflections around GST as well.
Well, can I say the obvious thing for most states is to make sure that they've got sufficient revenue to deal with their ever-increasing responsibilities when it comes to delivering services. The point I make is I think the Commonwealth are rapidly disappearing from view when it comes to their responsibilities, whether it's around Gonski or, from my state's perspective, infrastructure funding. We have a long list of examples where they've essentially just exculpated themselves from responsibilities, and the states have been left holding the the responsibility for delivering what are essentially the economy growing foundations for the future. So, from my perspective, I think the key is to have a sensible foundation around the way that our federation operates, and I've often said that the best way to reform tax, whether it's to talk about state or federal taxes, is to at least start from the perspective of the citizen and say, well, what do they expect from governments? And clearly they expect good provision of services. They expect government to have appropriate levels of responsibility so that the appropriate tier of government can be held accountable for the actions they're taking. So, from my perspective, a conversation around how our federation operates should preempt any discussion around tax reform, because if we can't get our federation functioning properly, all we do is have governments of different tiers allocating blame and trying to divest responsibility for their shortcomings. In terms of taxation reform, well, given the pressures upon state governments to continue to be able to deliver their responsibilities and pick up the shortfall from the Commonwealth, which is becoming ever apparent to us all, then ultimately my view is what we can do is generally at the margin. Yes, we can reduce the level of payroll tax obligations, and we've done that. We've increased the payroll tax threshold from $550,000 to $650,000 progressively over the next 4 years, and that means that essentially that's the first time that threshold's been raised in Victoria since 2002, and it essentially means that we'll have businesses now that have payrolls between 5.5 million and 27.8 million who have the lowest payroll tax burden anywhere in the nation. Those sort of reforms I think are important. They provide a bit of competition between the states, and quite frankly I think a bit of competitive tension is not a bad thing in terms of good policy outcomes. But more importantly, if we're going to talk about serious reform, then we need to look at how our federation functions and what Australians expect to get out of good government. And at the moment, I think what they're getting is excuses, particularly coming from Canberra.
Thank you. I think we'll come back to that federal conversation in a minute. Tom, taxation reform priorities for South Australia?
After I was sworn in as Treasurer, we conducted a tax reform package within South Australia. We got Chris Richardson to lead a paper on what we should do is reform our tax base. We're a small economy in comparison to the other states. We have to work twice as hard to gain investment. We have to be twice as efficient as everyone else. As a reform, as a consequence of our tax reform process, we abolished a whole series of taxes. Non-residential stamp duties will be abolished within South Australia. All rural and non-rural property transactions will have no conveyance duty attached to them by the end of 2018. We'll be the only state in the Federation not to charge that. And the reason we've decided to do that is because we want to incentivise transactions. Conveyance duty is an inefficient tax. It inhibits transactions, it inhibits economic growth. I disagree with my colleagues on payroll tax. I think payroll tax is an efficient tax, as is land tax. It doesn't inhibit economic growth or inhibit transactions. What we need to do as a state is to give our citizens the most efficient tax system we possibly can, and that's what we've attempted to do. And I think what you'll find from the anecdotal evidence is by not charging taxes on corporate reconstructions, not charging taxes on business conveyance duty for property, real and non-real, sees that you do get more transactions in your jurisdiction. You do get businesses amalgamating. You do get family businesses who've waited to restructure for decades, waiting for a change of ownership to do that restructuring now to make their businesses more efficient. It works. And you do get better efficiencies out of the economy. But the real debate here is about the GST. And look, I'm with John Howard. I believe in big government. And John Howard was the greatest proponent of big government this country's ever had. The GST is a debate that we need to have. We supported the New South Wales government in its call for GST reform. It's not easy, it's difficult. And it's difficult as a Labor state to go out and argue for this type of reform, but the reality is we are being asked to do more with less. And that means less money for us to cut taxes on business. And if business is being taxed more, they employ less, they do less transactions, and they don't grow at the same rate as our trade competitors. We need to have GST reform. And I'd like to see it back on the table again. I think there's something we can do about the GST. Now, whether or not the current Prime Minister and the current Treasurer have the courage to do so is a matter for them. But when Premier Baird and Gladys stood up and said that they wanted GST reform, we decided to stand alongside them. And that wasn't easy. Friends and friendships get strained. But the truth is, this debate first began in the 1980s, and it's a debate that Labor should not be afraid of. It's a debate Labor should embrace, because we are the party of reform. We are the party of macro and microeconomic reform. Many of the great reforms this country has benefited from for nearly 30 years of economic growth began with a Labor Prime Minister and a Labor Treasurer who decided to reform the economy and the country. And I think we can continue to do that. So I want to be on the side of reform. I know it's hard. We can make it fair, and I'm up for it.
So just one subsequent question in light of those last remarks, particularly around the GST. Is there something, Tom, that is holding this back right at the moment? If there was one thing you could ask to be changed or influenced, what would that be in order to deliver what you just said, which is to bring it back for a more fulsome sense of reform?
Look, I think every politician enters public life with an agenda, something that you want to achieve, something you want to get out of your time in politics. Not necessarily legacy, but you want to be productive while you're there. And again, without wanting to be too combative and too negative about the current government, I'm not quite sure why they are where they are. I'm not sure what the agenda is. I'm not sure what the long-term aim is. Economic efficiency and vertical fiscal imbalance is something very important for the Commonwealth to tackle. We are about to enter a stage where some of the lowest paid workers in Australia will be paying some of the highest levels of income tax because of bracket creep. And because there's no economic reform on the agenda, the Commonwealth Treasurer is quite happy to see that situation continue to plug the gap. That's unacceptable for productivity, it's unacceptable for wages growth, it's unacceptable for our citizens, that we are entering most of our community into the highest tax brackets with our trade competitors. It makes business uncompetitive, puts a strain on wages growth. We need reform, and we need it now. So the biggest hurdle is the Commonwealth Government.
Okay, so let's go to federal financial relations then, as part of the conversation. Reforming the financial relations between the Commonwealth and the states and the territories does provide an opportunity to increase the efficiencies between the different levels of government, and that was something you were touching on earlier, Gladys, to improve the sustainability of our nation's tax, our prosperity and general accountability as well. So national partnerships were a key instrument of the federal financial framework. So I would be welcoming, again, through the sequence here, starting with you, Gladys, just about the opportunities for reforming financial relationships and specifically your experiences with the national partnerships, please.
Sure, and I think this is where all of the states are in agreement. I'm sure they'll correct me if we're not, but certainly the NPAs or National Partnership Agreements have mixed results insofar as they don't give certainty to state governments in relation to funding. You've got to reapply after a certain period. Some expire at the end of 3 years, some at 2, some at 5, some at 1. And what I've been heartened by is the Federal Treasurer saying to all the states, he's up for us to consider how we can have a bit more certainty around those arrangements and, in fact, reduce federal discretionary funding to the states. I mean,
Yep.
I'd be really, really supportive of a system which incentivised states to engage in further competition reform or other incentives such as the asset recycling strategy which exists for us to seek funding from. I think just as the business community is always talking to us about having a certain operating environment, we're the same when it comes to the federal government, and we've made those views clear. And I think we've all been heartened by the response that's come back to say that's somewhere we can definitely have improvement within. So I think you will see. I think you will see some progress on that matter, and hopefully in a couple of weeks when we all get together. But certainly the competition reforms outlined in the Harper Review have formed the basis of those conversations. And I think, as you've detected from all of us, irrespective again of our political affiliations, we certainly as states appreciate the need for a much more certain operating environment. And again, the reduction in, I mean, can you appreciate how many bureaucrats would be involved in renegotiating program funding across 22 different portfolio areas, or whatever the number is, every year or every 18 months or every 2 years? It's almost an ongoing process, and I would much prefer have a bit more certainty, less discretion, and those incentive payments, I think, are a good way to start the conversation.
Thank you. Tim, immediate opportunities for reforming the financial relationships, and also any remarks about the national partnerships?
Well, I think the most obvious thing is there's got to be a serious desire for reform. I think the idea, the problem with national partnerships is they're partnerships in name only, more often than not. The Commonwealth is under no legal obligation to adhere to them, and will, on occasion, walk away from them if it suits their budgetary purposes to do so. And I think this probably stems from a fundamental problem that emerges out of Canberra. I mean, we employ a lot of public servants telling states how to suck eggs and how to do their job properly. And I don't think they particularly know the physical and the capacity issues that the states actually have to deal with. So a much more balanced and, might I say, cooperative approach, partnership in spirit, not just in name, is something that we probably need. I find increasingly that Canberra is getting further and further removed from the day-to-day responsibilities of managing the services that states have principal responsibility for, but increasingly they delude themselves into thinking that they're experts in a field that they have little practical experience in. I describe them as mendacious dilettantes, really. They have a view about everything, and rarely is it necessarily backed up by a clear appreciation of the material circumstances that state operate. Let me give you an example. We've had a number of debates about GST reform, and please spare me from another one in the public domain. We've had this go on and on as if it's intended to be the big ticket item reform. So, Tom, I'm sorry to break the chummy relationship, but Victoria's not up for it. We are just not up for it. If the Commonwealth want to talk about reforming the Federation, and if as part of that, tax reform right across the board is on the table, fine. But to simply have another discussion about raising the GST, we're just not interested in it. And the reason why we're not interested in it, let's look at what happened in the last GST reform discussion. It started out as let's increase the GST. What was it, 12.5% to 15%? A variety of models were being advocated. We had Joe Hockey, the then Treasurer, advocating that what should happen is he'd be given some capacity to reduce company tax. Now, how on earth he managed to reduce company tax by elevating the GST, the mind boggles, but presumably it was by breaching the fundamental principle that the state of Victoria just won't walk away from, and that is the GST is a state tax, and all the revenue, bar the administration costs, go to the states. So it was a nonsense discussion to begin with, and it just got sillier and sillier as it went on. We got to a stage where I thought we probably had at least something positive out of the last Premier's Conference, which basically said let's look at reforming national partnerships such that they eat up less and less of state budgets so that the states get greater discretion over their budgets, but also let's look at the states having a common amount of income tax capacity that could be drawn down as a consequence of the Commonwealth relieving itself of national partnership obligations. Now, that has disappeared. So you've got to ask yourself, why did this great solution to an impasse disappear from public debate? Well, because it didn't suit the political circumstances of the time, because it wasn't something that was seen as being ultimately in the interests of the Commonwealth to pursue, despite the fact that they put it on the table. So the point I make is, please spare me another debate with Canberra about the GST and tax reform. I'm getting too old and too tired to be dragged through it again. If the Commonwealth are serious about this stuff, they should sit down quietly, privately, perhaps without the media even being involved in the process, and let's have a genuine discussion about what our federation should look like and what it should deliver for the population.
I agree with lots of what Tim and Gladys have said about national partnerships and especially special purpose payments. The Commonwealth Government don't know how to deliver services. They're not a frontline delivery agency. They collect lots of revenue. They have core business that they conduct, but they're not very good at running hospitals. They're not very good at running programs in disadvantaged communities. They're not very good at delivering services. And every time they intervene in these areas, they try and tell us, as Tim said eloquently, how to suck eggs, and it doesn't work. So giving states a level of discretion shows a mature relationship between the Commonwealth and the states that's mature and confident that we can deliver services in the areas where they're necessary. In terms of having a share of income tax, I understand, Tim, that work is still ongoing, and we are doing a bit of work on it, and I would like to see national partnerships folded into a percentage of income tax, which is then distributed to the states. One, it gives us options to get back into having a share of income tax. It's a very good growth tax, and it helps us deliver those services the Commonwealth Government is attempting to get us into a certain direction by linking them to a national partnership. But they're very inefficient, and as Gladys says, and Tim has said, the amount of time we spend trying to negotiate these things is inordinate. And of course, at one end, we're bound by them contractually, so we have to deliver. At the other end, with no notice, without even a phone call, they cut it at the other end, and we're left with the people on the ground, with the recurrent funding, and we have to make some very tough decisions about whether we cut that service or continue it. And it makes it very difficult to deliver these services in that climate. So it'd be much easier if we had ongoing agreements as a share of income tax.
Okay, thank you. So colleagues, we're out of time now that we do have an opportunity to ask the Treasurers a question. I think we have some roving mics. Light's a little strong, but I think there's one or two roving mics around. If I could ask, if you do have a question, put your hand up, identify yourself and put the question fairly briefly so that we can actually go through quite a few. Down here on the left is the first, very quick off the mark there.
Sue Ash, I'm part of the CEDA State Advisory Committee in Perth, and I run a community service organisation as my day job. You've made a number of comments, all three Treasurers, around the Commonwealth's engagement with service delivery. I'm particularly interested in your views about the marketisation of aged care and disabilities and what that's going to mean for your states, and any comments you've got about national policy directions.
Gladys, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Certainly, we're working very cooperatively in relation to the rollout of the NDIS, but more broadly, our approach to delivering social services in New South Wales has been to engage much more directly and readily with the non-government and private sectors. So in recent years, whether it's through social impact investment, through bonds, where we've seen, I just want to give you a very quick case study. Unfortunately, in New South Wales, we have about 20,000 children in out-of-home care, and that number keeps going up. So we looked at doing a pilot where we got the non-government experts to work on the ground with families. The private investors actually put up the cash for the bond, which we administered. Now, the private investor got a return of 8 and 12% respectively in the last 2 years. Not bad in the current cash environment, a return. The NGO was able to deliver a success rate of reuniting families of 67%, when our rate's close to 30%, and government saved money. So we got a better outcome, a return to investor, and that for us was a huge insight into the collaboration that can exist when you pull together all your resources, government, non-government and private sector. And we've now set up a huge exchange system in New South Wales where NGOs can actually pro bono get support from professionals on things they're not expert in. So NGOs are great at working with vulnerable people on the ground. They're often not that great at financial management and accounting. So a lot of the professional, I shouldn't generalise, and I apologise, I didn't mean to offend anybody in the room, I'm just being very general, yeah. But the point is that when governments spend billions every year and the outcome doesn't change, I mean, we keep pouring more money into the same thing. Unless you change the way you do it, you're not going to get a different outcome. And we made that call a few years ago, and we're starting to see the dividends literally. So a huge policy shift for us has been engaging much more directly with NGOs, private sector, and pooling resources in addition to allowing each sector to do what they do best. We're good regulators. The NGOs are great at working with the vulnerable families directly, and the private sector is good at putting up money and getting a return. So.
Well done. Tim and Tom, I might just keep going with the questions so we get a few. I think there was one down here on the right.
Thank you. My name's Peter Olar. I'm from the Council of Mayors, South East Queensland. I'll ask the treasurers to put their, collegiality with other treasurers, especially non-present treasurers, aside in answering my question. We're from a part of a world that has traditionally been very strong on growth, very strong on infrastructure investment, and has normally had a fairly strong economy. Great to hear that the results that are coming post-2008 and finally recovery in each of the big states. But a bit sad from our point of view. We're not cash flow positive. We don't have a surplus on the horizon. And we are right now falling into the trap that perhaps Sydney and Melbourne hit in the 70s and 80s, of letting our infrastructure spend and plan fall behind the population growth in the region. And we know that Sydney and Melbourne are still paying for that in terms of some pretty significant catch-up infrastructure spend. What's the advice for Curtis Pitt as Treasurer of Queensland to get us out of this hole and get us back to nation-leading infrastructure spend and growth?
Well, treasurers.
Look, I generally try to keep my opinions to the state of Victoria, and also gratuitously what I think of my engagement with the Commonwealth. I think I did once venture into the area of other states, and I suggested that the West Australians were a bunch of unreconstructed mendicants, and they didn't take kindly to that suggestion. So can I say, look, I think Queensland is doing a reasonably good job. It's a difficult situation that they find themselves in, and might I say, similarly, West Australia, with the obviously the downturn in the mineral resource boom. It's had an impact upon their operating positions. As I understand it, the state of Queensland is in surplus. If we start to criticise states for running surplus on the back of dividend yield, I think many of us will come in for some criticism along the way. You've got to be able to do it year on year. That's the real test of your capacities. One thing I would say is that I think we do need to recognise that state governments have ever-increasing responsibilities given the, can I say, the disappearing act that the Commonwealth's doing when it comes to services. So the challenge for us is always to look at new and innovative ways to deal with those constraints. And Gladys, of course, has spent a little bit of time talking about social impact bonds. I think ultimately they will play a role, but generally at the margins. The key for good government is to make sure that your expenditure is exceeded by your revenue growth, and that you always keep an eye to making sure that the services your community expects, to the extent you have the capacity to do it, you do it. And it's important, and we're all a little obsessed with economic infrastructure because we're economic ministers and we've all had a background in transport. But one of the things I would say is never underestimate the investment in people, in education and in health services. For the state of Victoria, we're principally a services-run economy, so making those investments actually yields considerable dividends into the long term. And if I was giving advice to anybody, it would be advice about my values. Invest in economic infrastructure to grow your economy, but recognise the best investment you can always make is in your people.